Chapter 9 Wolfstar's Explanation. Zared caught up with the Ravensbund chief Sara Douglass on Sigholt's main staircase. "What's wrong, my friend? Why has Salem summoned us this early? Gods, he'd been only back in his private chamber a few minutes before the impassive late guard was banging on his door." Sodomai shrugged, the tiny bells in his braided hair jingling merrily. "I can think of no reason Salem would pull us from our beds this early, Zared." "Not for counsel, surely." His question was effectively answered, as Riverstar and Zenith joined them from one of the landings. Neither had a seat on the council. Zenith, Zared noticed, looked as haggard as he felt. She shook her head at Zared's inquiring glance, while Riverstar ignored both him and Sodomai. Riverstar had her own reason for feeling tired this morning. Below them, Zared heard Freefall softly greet Ilgain of Nor. Then both the Akari Talon and the Norse prince were behind them. Zared nodded greetings at them, noting that both wore worried expressions. What was wrong? Invasion? Surely not. Who would invade? "Have Farlight scouts reported the troops I have mustering west of Jervois Landing?" Zared wondered, fear turning his belly into ice. But he quelled the thought quickly, filling his mind with jumbling images of the landscape between Severin and Sigholt. This place was full of enchanters, and the most powerful of all would be in this hastily convened gathering. Zared needed none of them reading his mind. Even Zenith had indicated last night that she owed her highest loyalty to Tensendor itself. Where were Hermie and Theode? Not called to this meeting, that was apparent. Were they already in chains in the dungeons? Were their confessions already being signed with their blood? Stop it. Zared carefully arranged his face into a neutral expression. Rivka had carefully nurtured her son's vivid imagination. Now Zared cursed it. Salem lived in the spacious apartments that had once belonged to his parents. The central chamber was large, but it now seemed crowded with people moving about, finding themselves seats or stools, murmuring greetings, raising eyebrows in puzzled anxiety. "By the stars themselves," muttered Freefall Sunsore behind Zared, clapping a friendly hand on the prince's shoulder. "I hope my nephew has had the foresight to order us breakfast." Zared nodded, smiling slightly. He respected Freefall greatly. The Akari Talon was an extraordinary birdman, not only because, as most of the Sunsores, he was exceptionally beautiful with his violet eyes and silvery white wings, but because he had once died for Axis, only to have the star god himself plead for the return of his soul with the gatekeeper in the realms of the underworld. Freefall's journey to the gates of death had changed the birdman. He was still fun-loving and quick-witted, but there was a depth of experience and knowledge about him, even an eerie stillness that touched the souls of all in his presence. Freefall found a stool to sit on, folding his wings neatly behind him and his hands patiently on his lap. Ilgain of Nor, his dark eyes mischievous, and his person beautifully clothed and jeweled even this early in the morning, touched Zared on the elbow. "There, a couch. If we leap and shove and scream, I believe we can get there before Ascom drapes himself along it." Zared bit his cheek to stop himself from grinning and followed Ilgain, decorous and polite despite his words, across the room and sat down next to him. He chatted quietly with Ilgain about inconsequential matters while looking about the chamber. Salem, who had called everyone so hastily from their beds, had yet to make an appearance. All the five were here. Ascom was lounging against a window, and Sodomai had taken a stool next to Freefall, as well as Riverstar and Zenith, who Zared was amused to note had sat as far away from her sister as possible. Salem had also invited Spikefeather Truesong and Wingridge Curlclaw. Zared did not know either very well. Both, if not aloof, were in some undefinable way unapproachable. Besides, Spikefeather now spent so much time with Orr the ferryman, it was little wonder that few among the Akari, human, damn it, race knew him well. The gathering had arranged themselves comfortably, and were either quiet or murmuring softly to their neighbors, when Salem entered from a door behind a curtain. Zared's eyes widened a little at the sight of him. Salem had also spent a sleepless night, it seemed. He was dressed and groomed perfectly, but his eyes were lined and weary. Something was worrying Salem badly. A knot of fear coiled about Zered's belly. He had seen many guards stationed in the main stairwell, or corridors as he'd come to Salem's chambers. No, but they could now be lining the walls, and the strike force could be wheeling outside the windows, for all he knew. He caught eyes with Zenith. She shrugged slightly, but indicated with a small gesture of her head not to worry. Salem had not discovered that Zered had spent so many hours with Leah last night. Maybe not that, Zered thought, but what else? Gods, where was Hermie? Theod? Salem walked to a spot before the unlit fireplace, so large and extensive that its mantle loomed above his head. "I am sorry to have called you here so early," he said, "but something has happened that—" The outer door opened and Drago walked through. 2 steps inside he stopped, apparently astonished at the gathering in Salem's apartment. He ran his eyes slowly about those assembled, his eyes lingering on Zenith and Riverstar. Then he looked questioningly at Salem. "Brother? I do beg your forgiveness for so intruding." Zered thought he sounded anything but apologetic. In fact, Drago's voice was carefully neutral, so perfectly modulated that his words sounded like a speech he'd carefully rehearsed walking up the stairwell. "But I was searching for Zenith, and one of the guards told me I could find her here." Drago paused, as if waiting for someone to say something. When no one did, he carried on. "If I may ask, why so many people crowded into your chamber, Salem? This all seems unusual." Salem stared at his brother, his eyes blazing, but Drago held his stare easily, his own face carefully set into an expression of inquiry. Zered thought it extraordinary. Few people could hold Salem's gaze when he was angry, and he so obviously was now, but Drago apparently had no difficulty. "Every member of our family who is currently in Sigholt seems to be present," Drago said very softly. "Yet I wonder why it is you forgot to extend me an invitation as well." Zered had to repress a small, hard smile. There was the crux of the matter. Drago had heard about his hastily convened meeting and decided to attend as well. He'd put Salem in a difficult position. If he asked Drago to leave, Salem would look petty. If he asked him to stay, it would be clear that Drago had forced him to back down. "Perhaps as Drago has business with me," Zenith said into the silence, "he could stand with me here until this meeting is over. Unless your errand is so important, you suggest I leave now with you, Drago." Drago finally dragged his gaze away from his brother. "No, it was but a trivial idea I had for a new board game, Zenith. But as I find the rest of the family here, I might as well stay." And he walked over to his sister, stepping around Freefall and Sodomai as he did so. Salem looked at Zenith, looked at Drago, then took a deep breath and noticeably bit down his temper. Zered thought it must have taken a particular effort, for Drago had verged on the insolent, but Zered had also come to admire Drago's nerve, and sympathize with the man for being so obviously excluded from the life of Sigholt. For a Sunsore, that would indeed be a galling treatment. Despite the terrible deeds of Drago's youth, Zered rather liked the man, and had always got on well with him. Drago was quick-witted and fast on his feet, and often spent a morning at weapon practice with Zered when the prince stayed in Sigholt. Zered had good cause to rue the occasional lapse of concentration that had seen Drago give him a deserved nick with the sword blade. Watching him slip beside Zenith, giving her a small smile, Zered decided that Drago was talent and intellect ignored and wasted by most of his family. Then Salem spoke again, and Zered turned his eyes back toward him. "Wolfstar has reappeared," Salem said, and watched the faces of everyone in the room. All wore varying expressions of horror, amazement, and shock. All, Salem noted with disquiet, save Drago, who managed to combine shock with a certain degree of thoughtfulness, as if weighing up the possibilities for mischief in this development. Salem shifted his gaze to Zenith, who was so pale as to be ashen, and held a trembling hand to her throat as if deeply disturbed, and then looked at Riverstar. She had recovered quickly from her shock, it seemed, for she held his gaze easily, her lips curled in one of her seductive smiles. The gathering was quickly recovering from its surprise, and now voices rose and fell, asking questions, demanding explanations. Wolfstar was a name well known throughout Tensendor, and equally deeply distrusted. The renegade enchanter Talon had not only murdered hundreds of Akari children, but had, to all intents and purposes, allied himself with Gorgrail, enabling a frightful creature to all but destroy Tensendor with his ice and Skraelings. True, he had fathered Azur, and she had been instrumental in enabling Axis to eventually defeat Gorgrail. And true, the word was that Wolfstar had been fighting on behalf of Axis all the time he had stood at Gorgrail's side. But that was almost beside the point. Wolfstar was an enchanter of frightening power, enough to see him come back from death through the Stargate, and who worked only for his own purposes. And even if Wolfstar's purposes might ultimately be for Tensendor's well-being, they had the appalling habit of causing the death of tens of thousands in their unraveling. Freefall locked eyes with Salem. "I like this not," he spat. "What mischief does Wolfstar now?" Salem shrugged, made as if to say something, and then turned to Zenith as he spoke. "I felt a horror last night," she said, her eyes huge and round, her cheeks still pasty. "A sense of doom, as if the stars were falling in. Was this Wolfstar?" "Undoubtedly, Zenith." Salem swept his eyes about the room. "He appeared at the Stargate while Orr was there. And what they heard, and then what I heard, needs to be told, so that, has council been called already, without my presence?" An extraordinary figure had appeared in their midst. No one was sure if he had slipped in through the door, unnoticed, or had simply used his extensive powers, a combination of both the earth magic and the star dance, to materialize among them. The man was tall, slender, barefooted, bare-chested, and smooth-backed, his lower body wrapped in a cloth that, although it hung gracefully about him, looked as if it had been woven from bark and twigs. His eyes were emerald green and fierce, as if he might snap at any moment. His hair was a tangle of wild curls, the color of sun-faded wheat, and at his hairline, on each side of his forehead, curled two unmistakable horns. Israel, hope of the Avar, conceived of Axis Starman and Faraday when she had been Tree Friend. Zenith shifted nervously, as did most others in the room. She was slightly apprehensive of her older brother, although he was only a few years older than her, and although they had shared a childhood at Sigholt, Israel had changed since leaving to live with the Avar in the great forest to the east. Where once had been laughter was now only studied silence. Where once had been shared warmth was now only wary distance. Now Israel was all forest, all for the Avar, alien as if he had never shared a childhood with the other Sunsword children. There was a darkness, almost violent in its intensity, about the Mage King, a tension within him as if he would uncoil and strike at any moment. His mother, the creature that had once been Faraday, still roamed the Minstrel Sea and the Evernheim forests, but was so fey and so shy that Zenith did not know anyone who had seen her over the past 30 years. "Israel," Salem finally said with commendable calmness, "this is not a council, but rather a hastily convened gathering to discuss my late-night meeting with Wolfstar." Israel's eyebrows rose almost to his horns. "Then I am indeed glad I made the effort to arrive a day or so ahead of schedule. I have long held a wish to meet this demon of myth." "You should have spoken earlier, Israel. Had I known, I would have walked the paths of the sacred groves to meet you long before now." Barely over the shock of Israel's sudden appearance, everyone in the room now looked toward the gloomy, shadowed fireplace at Salem's back. Salem himself whipped about and stepped to one side. There was a movement within the vast interior of the hearth, and then a figure stepped out. Wolfstar. For everyone in the room who had never seen him, and that was most, it was immediately apparent from whom so many of the present-day Sunsores had inherited their copper hair and violet eyes. With his coloring and his golden wings, Wolfstar was not only remarkably handsome, but radiated such power that everyone in the room found themselves either stepping back or inching as far down in their seats as they could. Zenith cringed against a far wall, her knees threatening to buckle, her heart thumping erratically in her chest, barely able to breathe. The doom that had surrounded her last night had returned thrice-fold the instant Wolfstar had spoken, and now Zenith did not know how anyone else in the room could stay so calm, when to her the entire universe seemed to be in danger of self-destruction. A hand grasped her arm and prevented her from sliding to the floor. Drago. Zenith tried to speak, to thank him, but could not, for now Wolfstar was staring at her, now walking toward her, and Drago had to slide his arm about her waist to stop her from toppling over in the extremity of her horror. Zenith, Wolfstar said, stopping a pace away. It was not a question, not a greeting, just a statement. But Zenith felt as if he had somehow taken command of her soul with that one word. What was wrong with her? Why fear him so much? Why did he affect her this badly? Zenith, be calm. I am with you. I will protect you. Salem, speaking to her with the mind voice that all enchanters used, together with Drago's arm about her waist, it saved Zenith from fainting completely away. Wolfstar's eyes moved fractionally. He had also caught Salem's thought. No one can best me, fool boy. His mind moved back to the birdwoman before him. Zenith, do not fear me. Never fear me. And he reached out and touched her cheek. Some of the unreasoning fear vanished with that touch, but with it came a muddle of confused thoughts and images. The dome of the stars on the island of mist and memory, but seen from the interior, where Zenith had never been. A room in a peasant house, a man advancing to her, his hands outstretched in anger, a child, a raven-haired girl nursing at her breast. Wolfstar's fingers dropped from her cheek, and with them went the images. Wolfstar smiled, his eyes tender, then turned slightly to Drago and snarled. It was a horrible, harsh, totally aggressive sound, and it appalled everyone in the room. Drago himself literally thudded back against the wall, and no one watching knew if it was simply his own fear and shock that had caused him to leap backward, or Wolfstar's power. Vile creature! Wolfstar spat at him, his hands twitching. Azure should have killed you for your efforts in trying to murder Salem. Why quibble about a few years between deed and execution? Drago shot back. My mother may not have killed me then, but she ensured my inevitable death. Zered, watching, was consumed with two equally strong reactions. First, incredulity that Drago should have so quickly recovered to meet such frightening anger, and secondly, a sudden insight into how Drago must feel living with virtually immortal siblings, and knowing he had once shared that future, while he lined with age day by day. Wolfstar hissed in Drago's face, but this time the man did not flinch, holding Wolfstar's furious eyes with the ease that he'd previously held Salem's. By the gods of earth and stars, Zered thought, that man has more courage than a battalion of battle-hardened soldiers put together. Wolfstar, Salem snapped, and the enchanter turned about, rearranging his expression into one of genial goodwill as he did so. But there is one more I must yet greet, he said as he stepped over to Riverstar and kissed her full on the lips. Riverstar's lusts were so widely gossiped about that even Wolfstar had heard of her escapades, and as sexual liaisons between grandparent and grandchild within the Sunsore clan were not forbidden, he supposed Wolfstar had full right to so lingeringly enjoy Riverstar's mouth. Certainly Riverstar was in no hurry to end the kiss. About the room eyes dropped, and cheeks reddened. Zered himself eventually looked away. Even high Tensendoran societies has its pruderies, he thought, although both Wolfstar and Riverstar seemed intent on making an exhibition of themselves. What a beautiful girl Azure birthed, Wolfstar whispered, and so practiced. Riverstar almost visibly preened. Wolfstar. Salem's voice cut across the tableau, and Wolfstar straightened and looked about, locking eyes here and there, smiling as people shifted and dropped their own gazes, acknowledging Freefall and Sadomai with a nod. Zared himself felt Wolfstar's power as the enchanter's eyes swept over him, but Wolfstar apparently thought Zared of no account, for he spared him nothing more than a fleeting glance. For the first time since he'd entered the room, Zared let himself relax. Salem knew nothing about the troop movements in the west, and, of course, Zared told himself, they are not only there in case Aska moves against me, and even if Wolfstar had reappeared, no one yet had been burned to ashes, and Sigholt still stood as solid as ever. But Zared flicked a glance at Zenith. She had recovered somewhat, but still appeared nervous and shaky. Israel, who of all in the room appeared least put out by Wolfstar's presence, now stood with his arms folded across his chest and his feet well apart. "Where have you been, Wolfstar? The last anyone heard of you is when you confounded my father amid the icy drifts of the northern tundra 40 years ago." Wolfstar grinned at the memory. "Axis thought to best me. He failed. But to answer your question, I have been—" He paused, his face set in a theatrical expression of thoughtfulness. "About. Drifting." "That explanation will hardly relieve any minds within this room," Salem said. "Much can be accomplished in 40 years. But no mischief, Salem, no mischief. Now, would you like me to explain to this group of open-eyed, slack-mouthed listeners what we heard," Salem interrupted, obviously increasingly irritated by the way Wolfstar so effortlessly commanded the room. "Was something beyond the Stargate. Something that whispers, something that has caused Wolfstar to reappear. Whatever it is, or they are, it calls for Wolfstar." Voices again rose in shock and bewilderment. "Something beyond the Stargate?" Salem's voice cut across the murmuring. "Wolfstar, will you speak? Will you offer for once some degree of explanation?" Wolfstar, whose eyes had drifted back to Zenith, her own gaze now firmly on the floor, sighed and looked about. "I threw 212 Ikari through the Stargate," he said bluntly, horrifyingly, into the slight silence that had followed Salem's request. "I killed them, including my wife Starlaughter." "And her son," Freefall put in grimly. "The Sunsword Talons had long lived with the guilt that one of their number had committed such atrocities." "We had named him." Wolfstar shifted his weight slightly, hiding the momentary gleam of amusement in his eyes. "We had named him Dragonstar." Utter, horrible silence. Zared could not believe his ears. Dragonstar had been Drago's birth name, given to him by his grandfather Stardrifter, and stripped from him by Azure when she had also taken his enchanter powers and Ikari heritage. Zared risked a look at Drago. The man appeared as frozen as a trapped hare, his eyes locked with Wolfstar's. "Imagine my amusement," Wolfstar continued, now moving his gaze about the room, "when I discovered that Stardrifter, insipid fool that he is, had unwittingly named you after my lost son." Salem took a step forward, his eyes sharp, his voice heavy with angry power. "Is this your manipulation, Wolfstar? Did you twist Stardrifter's mind so that you could enjoy your amusement and our discomfort so many years later?" Wolfstar laughed merrily, driving the witting cruelty yet deeper into Drago's heart, and waved a casual hand. "No, it was sheer coincidence, or maybe fate. I do not know." He looked back at Drago. "I believe, Drago, that had you not mishandled your infancy so badly, you would have grown into an enchanter unparalleled in the history of the Ikari, as my Dragonstar would have done." Drago was now staring fixedly at a lamp far across the room, as if he could not trust himself to look at Wolfstar. "And yet here my unfortunate brother is," Riverstar said, unable even in this crisis to control her vicious tongue. "A cripple in every sense save the physical one. Even then, I hear the kitchen girls laugh behind his—" "Hold your tongue, girl!" Zared had heard enough, and gods knew what Drago was going through. "Enough, Riverstar. Can you not see or understand what Drago is feeling? Can you not feel his pain?" Drago looked at Zared with complete astonishment, and Zared wondered if this was the first time in his life someone had actually spoken on his behalf. Riverstar slowly stood to her feet, furious that this mortal had spoken so harshly to her. "Do not forget, uncle," she hissed, "that I also witnessed Gorgrail tear Salem from Amibe's arms because of Drago's persistent jealousy, and I watched as Gorgrail sliced the flesh from Amibe's bones. I believed then," she turned her gaze to Drago, "that he would direct Gorgrail to my murder as well. I feared for my own life. That is a fear, Zered, that twists and warps." Along with everyone else, Salem was looking at his sister, but he had lost all sense and understanding of being in this chamber. All he could see was the horror of Gorgrail plummeting from the sky. All he could feel was the terror of knowing his brother had plotted to kill him by the vilest means possible. For decades, Salem had fought to bury that memory, fought to forget the frightful weeks he'd spent trapped in Gorgrail's ice fortress, fought to heal himself of the scars on his soul as his body had healed itself from the scars inflicted by Gorgrail's talons. But now the emotions and words of this room had called it all back, brought the fear and the pain and the uncertainty slithering to the surface again. He blinked again, and finally managed to control himself. He was beyond that now, far beyond it. Surely. His eyes drifted to Drago, and a lump of unreasoning fear rose in his throat. And Zered thought to defend Drago? Why? Was he in league with Drago? Freefall watched the emotions flow over the faces of Axis's children. Fear, hatred, bitterness, sadness. All were evident. How is it, Freefall thought, that Axis and Azure united a land so deeply divided, yet left a brood of children separated by such appalling antipathy that they can barely keep themselves from one another's throats? He sighed and spoke. "Wolfstar, is this coincidence of naming of any consequence?" "No, Freefall, none. It is not even surprising. When you think about it, the son of whom Starlaughter carried was very, very powerful, and so Dragonstar was an appropriate name for him. Azure also carried an immensely powerful son, and Dragonstar was also an appropriate name for that baby. And yet as I was stripped of my name and heritage," Drago said, his voice under tight control, "so was he. Both Dragonstars doomed just before or just after our birth." Salem had stared flatly at him. "Wolfstar's son did not deserve his fate, Drago. You did." Drago visibly winced and dropped his eyes, but Wolfstar grinned impishly at him. "Oh, but he did. He did," he thought, his mind masked from all other enchanters in the room. "Like you, Drago, my son plotted to steal my heritage, as you plotted to steal Salem's. Maybe it's something to do with that name." "Continue, Wolfstar," Salem said, his eyes still on Drago. "We have not yet got beyond the front gate of your explanation." Wolfstar shook himself from his entertaining train of thought. "I killed 212, he repeated. "I threw them through the Stargate in my obsession to discover a way back. I thought that if one of those children, just one, managed to come back, then I would be able to do so as well." "You wasted 212 lives, Freefall said flatly. "At the time I thought it was necessary," Wolfstar replied. "I was afraid that the Stargate held more terrors than wonders. What if something crawled through that could threaten Tensendor?" "An admirable sentiment," Salem interrupted, "if only it were true. My father told me you were also intent on expanding your own power." Wolfstar smiled humorously. "No, not entirely. I was genuinely afraid of the potential threat that the Stargate posed. I wanted to understand all its mysteries, not only to expand my own power, but also to ensure Tensendor's protection. Well, to continue, every Akari birdman and birdwoman in this room has the right, as the Akari nation has the right, to sit in judgment for that act. None of the 212 came back, and I had lost the two I valued most dearly, Starlaughter and our son. Before I could commit acts of even greater horror, Cloudburst ended my misery, and the misery of the entire Akari people, with a heavy dagger thrust to my back. Wolfstar twisted in his seat, clearly remembering the feeling of the blade sliding in, the taste in his mouth as his lungs filled with blood. I died. I was entombed, and I walked through the Stargate. What did you find there, Wolfstar? Salem's voice was very, very soft. I found other existences. I found knowledge. I found that life, as death, are but passing dreams, and there were other things I found, and that found me, Salem Star Son, that I am unwilling to disclose, not until I am sure there is need. But this thought Wolfstar shared with no one. From the corner of his eyes, Zared noticed that Drago had leaned forward slightly, as if caught by the magic of Wolfstar's voice, or perhaps the vistas the enchanter's words had prompted in his mind. And other worlds, Wolfstar, Salem asked. Did you find other worlds? They exist, Salem. I experienced them. I cannot put it any other way, but I did not physically visit them. But they are there, yes. Do they harbor races who might invade? Zared ventured to ask, leaving the enigma of Drago for the moment. Wolfstar blinked. Races from other worlds? No. No, I think not. I did not sense any threat. Then what of the children you murdered? Zenith said. Zared was surprised to hear that although her voice was soft, it was strong. For surely it is they who disappeared beyond the Stargate. Will they come back? Her question made Wolfstar turn and stare at her for long minutes, as if he were trying to burn every angle, every plane of her face into his mind. Yes, he finally managed. You are right. They are those I killed. Do they pose a danger to Tensendor? Salem asked. No, they do not. They yearn for my blood, but I am here and they are lost beyond the Stargate. As far as I am concerned, that is the way it will stay. Israel shifted irritably. Then why do we hear their voices now, and never before? Wolfstar shrugged, not willing to take his eyes from Zenith. They drift. Lost. It is not surprising that they would eventually drift slightly closer to the Stargate than they had been previously. Should we help them come home? Freefall asked. His question was enough to make Wolfstar drag his eyes away from Zenith. No, we cannot do that. And why not, Wolfstar? Freefall's voice was very tight. Wolfstar took a deep breath. They have changed. Being thrown through the Stargate as they were, alive, terrified, into a cosmos to drift for thousands of years, has altered them. They are not what they were. If they were to come through, then yes, I would fear. Please believe me in this. No one in the room noticed Drago's eyes narrow. But you said there was no danger, Salem said. As long as they remain beyond the Stargate, Wolfstar replied testily, and I can see no way they can step through. You could, Salem reminded. You came back. Yes, I came back, but I went through under very different circumstances, Wolfstar explained, unwilling to disclose what it was that had helped him back. It wouldn't help the children, would it? I was a powerful and fully trained enchanter when I went through. I came back, but they will not. They do not have the skills, and they do not have the power. Believe me, they will never come back. In time, the interstellar tides will carry them far away from the Stargate. In a week or two, their voices will be gone. Salem stared at Wolfstar a moment longer. Then he turned to Spikefeather. My friend, get you to the Stargate and keep watch with Orr. If those voices come closer, if anything happens, then let me know. Spikefeather nodded and slipped from the room. Wolfstar raised his eyes above the gathered heads and looked at Wingridge Curlclaw.